Welcome to the Urbe ad Astra podcast, episode 8, with writer Greer Gilman, in which we talk about Shakespeare and language. I'm Jo Walton, Hugo Nebula Award-winning science fiction and fantasy writer and vocateur reader.
And I'm Ada Palmer, also a science fiction and fantasy novelist and a historian of European thought, censorship, books, the Renaissance, and today the cost of books relative to the cost of hats, which is what I've been working on today. Very important for understanding the finances at a Renaissance court.
And today we're going to talk about Shakespeare and Us with our awesome friend Greer Gilman. Welcome, Greer. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Greer Gilman, author of The Matter of Cloud. Moonwise is now 30 years old.
Wow.
My goodness. And followed by Cloud and Ashes. I have also written 2 mysteries with Ben Jonson detecting Cry Murder in a Small Voice and Exit Pursued by a Bear.
Such a great title.
And Greer is also famed for her ability to produce prose that experts in the history of the English language will confidently date to the 16th or 17th century with no doubt.
I actually did do that. I had one who said confidently that it was probably Thomas Nash, which chuffed me no end.
So as is clear, Greer shares our love of literature and theater of the early modern period. So we thought we would talk about that and how it overlaps with writing, but also the joys of seeing multiple performances of the same text. And the way, no matter how many performances of a text you see, and no matter how different they are, and indeed no matter how amateur and unprofessional and sometimes incompetent they are, every single one enriches your understanding of the text in some way.
Age cannot wither nor custom stale.
Very, very true. Age cannot wither nor high school amateurism stale. The richness of seeing a different performer engage differently with a different line or a different moment, or put a pause at a place where there was never a pause in any other production you saw in that particular scene that makes you rethink the words and stories.
I just want to say that there was a time once when Ada and I saw a production of Merchant of Venice, and we had tickets to see it again the week after. And it was so great that I emailed Greer in Boston and said, Greer, get on a train to Chicago and come and see Merchant of Venice with us. And she did.
Yes.
It was well worth sitting up in a carriage. I did not get a sleeping car. I sat up in a very studenty way.
Yes. Well, that particular Merchant of Venice production, which we all remember vividly, I think is a great launching point, because Merchant of Venice is a really neat example of a play that is quite challenging to make satisfying because of the differences between where a modern audience's investment is and where a modern audience's discomforts lie, versus where Shakespeare's expected audience's investment lay and where Shakespeare's expected audience's discomforts lie. And so it's on the people who are crafting any individual production of it to decide how to navigate those differences, to decide how to navigate our attitudes toward anti-Semitism, our sympathies versus Shakespeare's, and also our attitudes toward love and romance, and our attitudes toward this strange contest to choose the suitor, and our attitudes toward the trial scene, and our expectations of how justice should work, all of which differ from the audience for whom Shakespeare was writing, which means, of course, you can make every line of this work in a modern context, but you have to think hard about a lot of them and how you're going to navigate them. And every production does it differently. And that production did it in distinctive ways by adding scenes that weren't in English, by adding sequences that were in Latin, sequences that were in Italian at the very beginning, sequences that were in a carefully reconstructed attempt at a period version of Yiddish, that gave us glimpses of greater depth of the characters in a way that gave us a lot of the connective tissue for our modern sympathies that the text by itself doesn't.
I loved the way that all of the extra textual stuff was in other languages, that they were not trying to add English to Shakespeare's English and botch it up with English patches. It was essentially adding another kind of ground base to an already polyphonic text. They just added this ground base of Jewishness.
Yes.
One of the things that I thought was amazing about it was the way that it took things that were actually in the text, but that you're not usually shown, that you just hear, and showed them to us. Like the spitting on the gabardine. It's very different when you hear Shylock say, they spit on my gabardine, to when you see people actually spitting on his actual coat. It's viscerally different.
So this was a touring, it was RSC, right? Or was it the Globe? It was Globe.
It was the Globe.
It was Globe. It was a touring Globe production with Jonathan Pryce. And it began with a revel, because of course, in fact, the text begins with a bit of a revel. But we saw a long, extended Italian carnival revel with, you know, people dressed as Cupid and Psyche in that period way, and music and laughter and delight, in which we, the audience, become invested, and we are enjoying this party scene and imagining ourselves as potential participants in this party scene, which is an outdoor party scene, as if in front of somebody's villa, so that then when two Jewish people walk past and the drunken revelers attack them and beat them up and spit on them and laugh, as would be totally period, and as Shylock describes happening to him verbally in the text, but we don't see in the text, the audience has that sudden visceral, I was identifying with these people, and now these people are doing something that I'm finding abhorrent and anathema. I realize I need to think carefully about with whom I sympathize in this play, and that there are going to be people who I find appealing in some scenes, then do things that are abominable in the next moment. And it makes you aware of that and on edge and looking for it, and looking for the oscillation of characters between sympathetic and terrible before we hear the first word of Shakespeare's text, but grounded in things that Shakespeare actively describes within his text.
It both gives you what Jessica sees out her window and what Antonio is wondering why he's so sad in the midst of all of this revelry. So it gives you the context for her longing, her rebellion, and for his sadness.
And there was a wonderful moment where Portia is talking about how she's going to disguise herself as a man and go, and she's leaving Lorenzo and Jessica in charge. And she says to Lorenzo, you and Jessica, with a pause, as if Jessica's name itself is too Jewish and too exoticized and too strange. And she's being anti-Semitic in just the pause.
Yeah. Well, which followed up on the gestures earlier, where when they were hanging out on the island and everyone was happily lovers and the lovers are in two pairs and they're together, Portia kept treating Jessica like a servant. And when it was time to dance, handing Jessica her drink to hold for her while she danced in this wonderfully unthinking way, which isn't in the script, but wonderfully communicates the, you know, Jessica begins the play with these hopes that she's going to suddenly be a Christian and no longer subject to all of these prejudices, and makes the transition. And no, she is still subject to all of these prejudices. They do not vanish overnight with her conversion.
Indeed not.
So that's where moments added with the language of gesture expand and gave the text what it needed. Though that was following up on the second added non-English language scene, which is the reconstructed historic Proto-Yiddish argument between Jessica and her father, which happens the first time we see them together on stage, and they're yelling at each other. And it sets up her tension with her father and really makes it feel like we understand why she's ready to run away. She's not running away purely for love. She's also running away from a father who is a curmudgeon and a father who behaves as Shylock does toward other people and who behaves toward her in ways that you can understand the teenage rebellion combined with the desire to escape from the pressures of anti-Semitism and seeing this marriage, flight, conversion, elopement as being her path out of both of those things. It set up a tension between them, but also a family dynamic between them. It had the body language of father and daughter. Also the body language of, she is, as the adult daughter, she's the housekeeper as well, presumably, right? And it's the body language of two people who are roommates and yelling at each other about whether there are enough eggs, right? And of the accustomedness to each other that is family and household management, as well as about money and about control, that set up so beautifully her having a dynamic relationship with him, because they have almost no screen time together or stage time together. They're almost never there interacting. It's all her talking about him while he's off stage, him talking about her while she's off stage, so that precious moment, which I think was less than a minute, establishing them through body language, which the audience is not understanding most of the words of, did so much.
Yeah.
And of course, the ghetto is permanent lockdown. They are stuck together. They're locked in together.
And I thought that the other really great thing about that version of the play was the fact that it took this absolutely problematic thing and went right at it front and centre. It made it about the anti-Semitism in a way that every other production that I'd seen was sort of awkwardly sidling around.
Well, sometimes they awkwardly sidle around. Sometimes they zoom in on it in the scenes in which it happens, and those scenes become all about it. And you have the Hath Not Jew Eyes speech, and you have the finale, and those are about it, but it's as if it vanishes during the scenes where the couples are hanging around and the scenes where the suitors are looking at caskets. And it's as if there's two different plays going on. And, there's a short play about anti-Semitism that happens in 3 acts, split amongst a silly comedy. And this one brought the anti-Semitism tensions into the other scenes as well, so that it was fully integrated, instead of oscillating between being about the one and being about the other.
And it was thinking about feminism as well, in terms of female power and what Portia does in a very interesting way.
In that final trial sequence where she, especially, and Jessica a little bit, but primarily she, is very much taking control of this courtroom scene and taking control of the lives and destinies of all of these men by adopting male garb temporarily, but also through her superior intelligence. But in a way that is also unbearably cruel to Shylock, and also sort of callous and selfish and playful. And also all about her then returning to her married life, where the power dynamic is going to be interesting, and we wonder whether it'll work having the woman who has been so used to being in control and powerful and testing and sorting amongst her suitors, and how he is going to handle this afterwards and so on.
Yeah, the marriage is the place where she loses. She has had remarkable power, even for a Renaissance woman, because essentially her father has set up the test, but she, as it were, the executor. She is managing, she is managing her suitors, and having someone win is a loss for her.
Well, it's a neat one where the staging can have an enormous impact on how much power she seems to have during the sequences where the suitor enters and there are the 3 caskets. Because I've seen stagings where the suitor enters the casket area and she's sort of shut up on a balcony, sitting there like the car that's the prize in a game of Wheel of Fortune, right? Just sort of watching very passively and feels very trapped. And I've seen versions where, as the suitor is going around the caskets, she's right there with him and sort of pointing at them and hinting and very clearly controlling, hey, pick this one, because she knows perfectly well which one has the correct answer by now. And so depending on how you decide to direct that scene and physically where you put her, you can have that scene be one where it feels like she's in absolute control of what's happening and playing with these men. Or a scene where we are reminded of, and it makes it feel very much like she is powerless and her destiny rests upon this absurd contest that her dead father set up, where she has to just wait, and no matter whether she likes the suitor or not, it's not up to her. But it's actually up to the staging, whether it's up to her.
None of her suitors until the last seems ever to have read a fairy tale.
Indeed.
Or heard.
Well, or you can make them seem savvy, right? You can have, because you have the leisure to have them move around the stage. You know, I've seen one once, I think it was a student production, that had the second suitor very nearly pick the lead one. But then Portia point at the silver one and the suitor go to it instead, so that it felt like, yes, actually that suitor was smart and might have won, but she didn't want them, and so she manipulates the contest, which is so empowering compared to the Portia who is trapped in a balcony or trapped in a... I remember seeing one time one that had a balcony that was set up with garlands of ivy that kind of looked like a bird cage. So she was in a bird cage while the choices were happening. Yeah, but I've also seen a production where the suitors were Muppets. Yeah, the first two suitors were Muppets being held by the handmaid who was doing great Muppet stuff. And you know she's not going to marry either of these clowns. They're clowns. So why don't we just make this a completely silly scene? And those scenes were delightful. And we got to see her flirt with the Muppets and then mock the Muppets as the Muppets forlornly go off to lead their mournful Muppet lives without being able to take Muppet brides. And it was hilarious, but totally severed from the anti-Semitism scenes, and very much one of those productions that felt like watching two different plays that alternated.
Yes, I think the immersion in anti-Semitism, the fact that it's never really not there, makes, it was at the end as it was if...
Yeah.
It was as if Shylock were being christened in acid.
Yeah, so the third added scene in the Globe one is the end, where after the end of the trial, we cut back to the happy lovers reunion. But then at the happy lovers reunion, when Jessica is handed the note that says the happy outcome of the trial, that she's receiving the property, and starts reading it, her face looks absolutely horrified, because of course we, the audience, realize she's also getting the word of what's happening to her father and that he's being forced to convert. And then the curtains open and enter a bunch of clergy in their robes, and we watch the baptism ceremony, which takes place in Latin, during which Jessica is singing her song of mourning for her father as a descant against the Christian Mass. And there was not a dry eye in that theater.
No.
Everyone was sobbing because his horror and his face and her grief layered over the unrelenting, almost military rhythm of the chorus of that Latin Mass advancing, and the happy lovers on the one side, and then the two, just Jessica and Shylock, in their grief, was overwhelmingly powerful. And again, united those two plays, those two separate for us plays, the play about anti-Semitism and the play of the lovers getting together, knitted those together into Jessica understanding the horror of what was really happening, and the two of them, even though they're separate at the end, being united by suffering the same griefs and her mourning for him. It was stunning.
And we didn't just have tears in our eyes, we were sobbing.
Yeah.
It was incredibly powerful and moving, and even the second time we saw it, it was still just as raw to hear her singing the alienu against the baptism. And I think baptized in acid is a really great way of putting it, Greer.
Yeah, the way his expression was as he's forced to say credo. Ugh. And I took a group of students to see this production as well as taking a group of friends. And both times I had people not say, I wish you'd warned me about the ending, but I'm torn about whether I wish you'd warned me about the ending. Because on the one hand, I kind of feel like that was so distressing it needed trigger warnings. But on the other hand, I felt like it wouldn't have had the impact if I hadn't had trigger warnings. And it was neat having those conversations and thinking about that question and what a trigger warning means when you, especially for people, none of these people that I took there hadn't seen The Merchant of Venice. Everybody knows what happens at the end, but you're not prepared for seeing it. And you're not prepared for seeing it be visceral like that. And the very interesting question of, do you put a trigger warning on the end of Hamlet that everyone will die? No, really, you'll be upset this time. Everyone will die. How do you trigger warning by the way, in this production of a story, the plot of which you know really well, we are making this element of the story hit with a hammer that often hits more gently. It's a fascinating question of trigger warning old texts or individual productions of old texts and exactly when it does and doesn't make sense and what it does and doesn't do. And I think the interesting one with that Merchant of Venice is short of describing exactly what it is, describing that you're going to see these two things against each other, which I think does undermine their power, but you would want to do it for someone that would be wanting to be prepared for that. I don't think it's possible to say, hey, in this production of Merchant of Venice, the ending will hit extra hard and have somebody really believe you or really understand enough that, no, it's going to be an order of magnitude more. It can be hard to trigger warning a thing the right amount, unless it's a personal friend who knows you well enough to understand what you mean when, by the way, the ending with Shylock is going to hit an order of magnitude harder. And it's extra hard because it doesn't hit at the moment you expect. Because it doesn't hit in the Shylock conviction scene. It hits afterward in the lovers' scene. When Shylock has left the stage for what in the script is the final time. And, this director adds an extra enter Shylock, enter clergy, Latin Mass that isn't there. And that extra enter Shylock, which, turns into the curtain call. But that extra enter Shylock at the end is a very challenging thing how do you characterize that?
It's an extra which is integral, which is hard to do.
Yeah.
Which is very hard to do.
And hard to communicate to someone exactly how it's going to feel so different being integral like that.
So that actually leads me to the question of spoilering Shakespeare generally, which is when you see a Shakespeare play for the first time and you're not familiar with it, it's actually very hard to see it for the first time because we live in a cultural context that has already pre-spoiled us for it.
Yeah, or for many of them. There are some of them you can usually make it in without spoilers for Cymbeline, Pericles, Prince of Tyre, Timon of Athens,
Yes.
a few others. But sure is hard for Hamlet, sure is hard for Romeo and Juliet, sure is hard for Lear, though it does happen.
Lear is the one where I really wish I'd seen it unspoiled.
I managed to. Yeah, it was hard. I had heard about Lear when I was very young, and I realized, this sounds like a really powerful play for which I want to not be spoiled. And I made a point of anytime I was near the word Lear, thereafter leaving. Just no, not until I get to see it, So I did manage to see Lear unspoiled, which is incredibly powerful, but hard to achieve in a labor of decades.
Of course, Shakespeare's original audience was shocked because they all knew the old King Lear, the Leir, which had the fairy tale happy ending, which had Cordelia surviving and marrying Edgar and and they his first audience were expecting that, and they got King Lear.
Although it says tragedy on the playbill, so there's going to be some tragedy, but you don't know how much, right? Tragedy on the playbill is the promise that there will be deaths. and that there will be a number of deaths, but that there won't necessarily be 100% deaths. And so the first time you go into a thing that says the tragedy of name, you're going in there not knowing who lives and who dies.
If he died but Cordelia survived, it would be sad, but it wouldn't be the shocking end that it is.
Mm-hmm.
No, because he's fourscore.
He is an old man, and children expect to outlive their parents, and not the other way around.
Well, and in other tragedies, there are plenty where a bunch of characters die but others live, like Titus, where there is an heir who lives, like Coriolanus, where many people live. You are prepared for that, and you're not prepared for... So you're in this genuine suspense. And especially for an audience that knows, oh, right, it's supposed to have him die and these people die, but these people live. It's shocking coming from that context.
I got to take my middle brother, who is passionate about theatre and very dyslexic, so he had not read Shakespeare. And I took him to Hamlet. He got it. He picked up immediately that Polonius was using Ophelia as a stalking horse. So he was a wonderful test case of, the original audience, the unspoiled audience.
Because boy, is the story Hamlet's based on not going to prepare you for Hamlet.
Well,
where's the princess who beheads everybody? Where's the sequence of battles and rival kings?
We've been doing a thing through the pandemic, which was every Saturday night we did a Shakespeare play reading aloud on Discord with a group of people, a shifting cast of people. And so doing that, I have finally read all of Shakespeare, because I'd been avoiding the ones that I hadn't seen so that I could see them rather than read them, because that's the best way to experience Shakespeare. So now I have had all of it. But the interesting thing was that there were always some people for whom any given play was unfamiliar, except for the ones that are most familiar to everybody.
Romeo and Juliet, especially.
Yeah. Romeo and Juliet, Hamlet, Merchant of Venice.
Did you have anyone whose first Twelfth Night it was?
Yes. Yeah, one person.
Because Twelfth Night is very, very, very performed right now. I think I've been watching patterns of which plays get performed a lot, because it's really neat to watch over time which plays get performed. I wish I remember the author of the great paper tracking the popularity of Coriolanus over time and how strongly it correlates to crises of confidence in government.
Indeed.
And Coriolanus no one will want to perform it for 70 years, and then there'll be a whole slew at once, and then no one will want to perform it, and then there'll be a whole slew at once. So this has been going on since it was written, and we've had a slew of Coriolanus's post-2016. But Twelfth Night is super ubiquitous, I think, because it feels like you can make it feminist, and people are very interested in performing it for that reason. It seems playful and it seems feminist.
It plays with gender, which is...
Yeah. And so it's been the number one presence in, when I average out the emails I get every year from Shakespeare companies of which plays they're doing, it's definitely plurality is Twelfth Night, which is neat to notice, but there are still, of course, people for whom any given play is unfamiliar.
Yes.
Sadly, we seem to be in a Julius Caesar moment.
Yeah, there have been a burst of those following on the Coriolanus bursts.
Yes.
So I twice, because there was one person in the lockdown who was reading in the 12th Night and wasn't familiar with it and just loved it. And also I took Sasha to see it, my son, when he was 10. We went to see it in Stratford, because what he wanted for his 10th birthday was to see a Shakespeare play and have a Chinese meal.
What a great 10-year-old you had, Joe.
Fabulous.
Yes, I've got to say, I feel very proud of this. And he's still great, but he's grown up now. And so we went to see it in Stratford, and we saw an RSC production in Stratford that was really great. And he wasn't familiar with it before that, and he loved it to pieces. And And of course, I've written a novel in Or What You Will. I use the characters of Twelfth Night after the play as one of the things that I'm doing in that book. So I sort of know every word of it. I'm really, really solid on Twelfth Night. And I can't even remember when I first saw it because I've seen it so many times because it's done so often. But I think the best Twelfth Night that I've ever seen was the travelling RSC production that I saw in Chicago with you, Ada.
Yep, the one that was so good that even though we were going to see Lear the next day, we ditched Lear to go see this 12th Night a second time.
Which was the one that had a 15-minute...
It was 22 minutes. I timed it the second time. 22 minutes of just the drunken revel with just one 4-line song lyric repeated over and over for 22 minutes. And this is one I really wanted to talk about because it's a really useful for craft of writing thing to think about, as well as the really useful challenges of dealing with the differences between our audience and Shakespeare's audience.
It's addressing the interesting problem for a modern audience of making us feel that what happens to Malvolio is okay.
And that the mocking and humiliation of Malvolio can feel comfortable or not. A big challenge in Twelfth Night is while all the other fun frivolity is going on, here we have Malvolio and he gets really, really, really harassed and mocked and messed with. And what are we going to do with this? Do we, just like the Globe production that centered the anti-Semitism in Merchant of Venice, do we make it a centerpiece and say, no, look, this treatment of Malvolio is not okay. We're going to engage with the fact that it's not okay. We can do that, but if we're doing that, this is kind of not a comedy anymore. And then you get the double play problem where it doesn't fit with how funny it is. Or you can adjust the harassment of Malvolio in some way to make it comfortable. One thing I've often seen is cutting the third sequence of it because, they want to mock Malvolio and get revenge on him. What are they mocking him and getting revenge on him for? A, he interrupted their drunken revels and yelled at them. We can sympathize with interrupting people's drunken revels and yelling at them as people who like to, for example, sleep. And B, we're punishing him for being attracted to his mistress and being ambitious, which we as modern people who think that people should be equal and aren't invested in social class separation in the way that Shakespeare's audience did, don't think is something necessarily that should be punished. So one thing you can do is say, okay, we'll have the point at which they give him the fake letter and he is convinced that his mistress is in love with him and he comes in the yellow stockings and makes an absolute fool of himself. And then we keep the second sequence in which they convince people that he's mad and lock him up. But we cut the third sequence in which, while he's locked up, he's really wretched and miserable and begging for help. And they keep mocking him while he's in false custody and dress up as the pretend doctor and physically beat him up and do all these other extra mean things to him that are just over the top. And one thing that I've seen production do is just cut that, the third one, so that it only has 2 sequences and it's milder and it's more comfortable. And if you're doing a short production, for example, if you're doing it at the Fringe where you're trying to cut this down to 60 minutes, makes perfect sense as a way to handle it and it just becomes comfortable level. This RSC thing did exactly the opposite.
It's intrinsically, at least to me, a bittersweet play. It's an edgy play.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, I think part of that is that it's a Robert Armin part. Shakespeare's company had 2 chief clowns. There was William Kemp, who was Bottom and Dogberry, and when he left, he was followed by Robert Armin, who was, we think, Feste and Touchstone and Lear's Fool. And he himself had, he had a philosophy of fooling, which he published, and there was a great deal of cruelty in that. He was an edgy, quizzical, tiny man with evidently a beautiful voice. And it's thought, at any rate, in recent scholarship, that Well, Shakespeare's work, I think, was always a collaboration with his company. He always wrote for the people he had. So, writing for someone like Robert Armin, I think his kind of cruelty of fooling got into, saturated what Shakespeare was writing. So, I think that was how the company and Shakespeare for the company was, as it were, the sense of the meeting then, how they were feeling then. I think Twelfth Night is uncomfortable. And there are a lot of uncomfortable things in it. I mean, really, Orsino is not worthy of her, really. And poor Antonio
Yeah.
is at Antonio and Malvolio, there are two left standing at the end who do not pair up, outsiders, and they're both treated quite badly. So I think it's very hard to say, well, if you take the third mocking of Malvolio out, it will be a more comfortable play, because it's not a comfortable play.
Yeah, it is a more comfortable play, but it remains salty, and it doesn't solve the problem. It eases the problem, I'd say, is my characterization of how those productions have felt. And when we think about this from a craft of writing point of view, because this is something that applies to writing a novel as much as it does to directing a play.
Indeed.
When you're going to have bad things happen to a character, you have to think very carefully about balancing how you want the audience to feel about that. Comfortable, uncomfortable, how uncomfortable, getting the discomfort level to be at the level that you want. So what this 12th Night production did was zoom in on the drunken revel scene, right? So Uncle Toby and Sir Andrew, come in and they're obviously totally drunk. And they start singing very slowly in a kind of a drunken, super mega slow way, one of the Drunken Revel songs.
It actually started with the previous scene. The people playing the music in this production are actually on stage the whole time, and you can see them, and they're physically playing the music and you can see them. And Viola storms off the stage and leaves them on their own on the stage, and they're kind of looking at each other like, what do we do now? The stage is empty. And then Sir Toby starts singing from lying down behind them, where you haven't noticed.
Because he passed out drunk there 2 scenes earlier and had been lying there passed out drunk for 2 scenes. And then he kind of mutters the song slowly. And then in comes, the other one, and he's got, for some reason, he's got a Velcro hat that you're supposed to, it's this toy where you throw balls at the person with the Velcro head, and they have to, try to catch the ball with their head, and it's a summer picnic kind of game. But he's obviously forgotten that he has it on. He's feeling his head with a sense of wonder, and he has the ball. He sticks it to his head and pulls it off again in this way that drunk people do, very slowly. And they start singing, and he starts singing along with the slow, drunken, "What is love?" And then it starts and he starts crying the way drunk people do in the middle of singing, "What is love?" But then they start singing a little faster, and one of them starts tossing the ball, and he catches the ball, and then he tosses the ball to the person in the front row, and the person in the front row tosses the ball back. And then he tosses the ball to somebody else, and the music is going a little faster as they're singing the Drunken Revel song, and it's starting to have some energy, and they're dancing, and they're throwing the ball back and forth at the audience, and the audience is kind of moving along with the music, and then one of them goes out and gets the audience to stand up and leads some of the audience members on stage, and they're dancing, and they're throwing the ball back and forth, and it gets into this really energetic revel where the audience is kind of singing along, and people are on the stage dancing with them, and then some DVD drunkenly orders pizza, and a pizza delivery person comes into the theater with boxes of pizza and hand pizza out to the audience, and they give pizza to the audience members that are on the stage, and Sir Toby has pizza, and we're all dancing and singing uproariously and throwing balls around and eating pizza in this big, happy, drunken revel that lasted for 22 minutes. And then in storms Malvolio. And revel and bursts on the stage and yells at the audience members who are on the stage and snatches the pizza out of my hands and hurls it on the floor. And shouts to get off, and you have to get off. And then he's the person who spoiled our party and took away my pizza and took away Lauren's pizza and and yelled at us and made us feel weird about being on the stage in the first place. And the whole audience is angry at Malvolio for being the no fun person who spoiled our drunken revel, not their drunken revel, our drunken revel, because slowly, incrementally, through this beautifully choreographed sequence, which is much of why we went back to experience it twice, to see how cunningly they notched it up slowly from the very drunken, even melancholy beginning through the exploration of the Velcro game into having the whole audience jumping up and down in our seats and laughing and the brilliance that was the pizza, to then make us resent Malvolio. And we are then complicit in wanting to see him get comeuppance for spoiling our party. Not their party, our party. And it was magical how it transformed the subsequent humiliations of Malvolio.
And I felt guilty, that I'd been singing along and stomping my feet and clapping. And then he came in and did it, and he made us all feel ashamed.
Yeah, like we were keeping Olivia up at night. Even though it's only arbitrarily night because they decided in this scene that it was night. But it's this wonderful, the sense of being chided. The sense of being chided is very emotionally powerful. And so similarly, and again, in a novel, you can't literally get the reader into your home eating your pizza. But you can have moments where the reader is laughing and the reader is delightedly enjoying something and the reader is rooting for something. And then the thing gets yelled at and turns out to be bad and the reader feels a little bit bad about being complicit in the thing that we were happy about. And then we get resentful for being yelled at about the thing. So you can set up those types of complicity in prose just as you can in theater in order to then set up something that's coming substantially later, but where you need the audience, whether it's a reading audience or a theater audience's feelings toward the characters involved, to be ready for this character to get comeuppance and to root for the characters who are comeuppancing or not.
What catches me, just for something very different, which also I think works, what catches me in both the novels, in fiction and on stage are crystallizations, metaphors that just say the whole thing. I remember a Twelfth Night, at least 40 years ago, on Boston Shakespeare Company, I think. And the drunken revelers, there had been a piano involved. And that piano, that's where they shut Malvolio. His prison was the piano.
Oh, neat.
Yeah, that's just iconic. It crystallizes the whole thing. Revelry is actually where revelry is his punishment. Revelry is where they're locking him up.
Yeah, that's a really neat one. Well, it brings me to the, every production, as I said, will have a moment that makes you rethink the play because of a particularity in that particular production, even if that particular production doesn't do anything else hugely differently. I remember the first time I saw a Romeo and Juliet, which had a very strong performer as the prince.
Oh, good.
And, when he makes those speeches about, Verona is bleeding, you're wrecking everything, and about how urgently he's trying to solve this, and when he steps in authoritatively, I remember coming out of that production thinking, the prologue is lying to me. This is a tale of three houses. Two alike in dignity and one greater in dignity, but trapped in the rivalry between the other two. You've been lying to me, Shakespeare. You've been lying to me, productions that didn't have a very strong actor in this role. I now understand this in a radically different context. Even though nothing else in that production was in any way different from, 6 or 7 other productions I'd seen. There was a student comedy of errors. Comedy of errors being a play for which it's easy to find mediocre productions because a lot of people think of the Comedy of Errors as a fairly easy Shakespeare play, whereas I actually think it's one of the hardest Shakespeare plays to make satisfying, which I'd love to dig into. But this was one where there's a scene toward the very end in which all of the ridiculous stuff has happened. And now the Duke is finally there, and we are explaining all the ridiculous stuff to the Duke as the Duke is about to execute the old man. And there's this long blah, 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 this happened, and my husband, blah, 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 and then the Duke says, what? And usually that's a very sort of forgettable line, because it's just an interjection in the middle of her speech, and then she keeps going. But in this particular production, they had the Duke seem really eager to behead the guy. And the Duke had the headsman's axe in a very comedy executioner kind of way. And during her long speech, he had the guy on his knees in front of him, bent over and like nudging him back and forth like he was lining up a croquet shot. Very much like, Alice in Wonderland, Queen of Hearts. And indeed, they had a black and white checkerboard floor, which really made it feel like Queen of Hearts. And he's got the guy like moving slightly to the left and slightly to the right, and he's lining up his shot as she's saying this more and more ridiculous thing, and he's obviously not listening. And then she gets to one point of it, and he just freezes and turns around and says, "What?" As if he just registered how ridiculous the thing was. It was so ridiculous. It was able to distract him from his croquet match and get him to actually wake up and be like, "Holy, what is happening?" And it was brilliant, and it made that line, which is usually, it's not a line I would have remembered existed if I were summarizing this play, which I have sat through dozens of times. I would not have remembered that line existed, except that one staging of it made that line so brilliant as being the moment that the moment that the strangeness and implausibility broke through the callousness of law to set us into a world where everything is upside down, which actually meant that later on, when the Duke is suddenly like, actually, I know I made a speech at the beginning of the play saying that I was going to execute the dude even though it was obviously cruel and tyrannical, but now I'm going to not execute the dude for no clear reason. Have a clear reason, and the clear reason was that the absurdity level had exceeded normal absurdity to the level that the Queen of Hearts is like, wait a minute, this is exceptional. I need to set aside standard mandatory tyranny of Wonderland to listen to this and be sympathetic. So that it made a moment that's often tricky in the play, the Duke suddenly relenting when he wouldn't relent before, even though obviously he should have relented before, makes sense in a way that it never had in any other production. This in a student production in which, the way they decided to differentiate the twins was by having one set of twins have fake Italian accents and act like Mario, which really didn't, really didn't work. And even productions that make unfortunate decisions about some things sometimes make a brilliant decision in another moment or bring to the fore a line that you hadn't thought about before.
There's nothing more cringeworthy than a production that is trying for one of those iconic images or iconic moments and blows it. I remember a student production of Pericles in which the relief of the famine consisted of sticking a strawberry Pop-Tart into a microwave and waiting the full minute for the ding.
Huh.
That was disastrous. I think I know what they meant.
Right.
I think I know what they think they meant. But no, didn't come off. There's always the problem of how do we illuminate this? How do we bring this to a modern audience? How do we make everyone go, oh? And sometimes people just get, many times, many productions just get completely wrapped up in their own cleverness and so miss it.
It's like the 1980s BBC Complete Shakespeare, where they did everything. and some of them are really great. The history plays, particularly the Henry VI and Richard III sequence
So good.
by Jane
I
Howell, are
love
just
the
amazing.
Cymbeline. I love the Cymbeline too.
But many of the comedies, they just don't make them funny because they're taking everything too seriously.
Yeah.
That As You Like It is like the worst. It's just
Well, and
terrible.
so it's, even though the actual actors are brilliant, and it's very fascinating and I think very informative watching those productions and letting them rethink and inform your understanding of these plays, because you see what it's like when the funny bits aren't funny, when the funny bits are read very seriously as serious social commentary, and what that does. And I would say one of the most changing your experience of a play forever productions of Shakespeare that I've ever seen is The Taming of the Shrew in that set. Because they got John Cleese.
Yeah.
And they don't let him be funny.
Yeah.
And John Cleese is enormous and terrifying. And that play is scary as heck with John Cleese in it, because he is, he could pick Kate up and snap her over his knee, and you're constantly thinking that he will. And that long scene of the servants being terrified of him and then of him threatening horrible violence to the servants is really scary. And to then compare that to a very funny production. The Globe has a DVD of a recent, now less recent, but fairly recent Globe production of it, which is hilarious. It's absolutely hilarious. And you're just side-splittingly roaring with laughter all the way through it. And it has gorgeous physical comedy. The sequence where they're at dinner and he asks his friend to quickly eat all the food, for which they brought in a whole roast chicken. And the actor, with amazing brilliance and skill, sort of gets the order to eat all the food, looks on the spot and kind of weirded out, and then just rips all the meat off of the chicken with his hands and shoves it in his mouth, and then sits for the whole remainder of the scene with his cheeks, puffed up with chicken as the rest of the punishment is happening. It is so side-splittingly hilarious. And then all the way through, it's funny. It is so funny. So that then when you get to Kate's speech about the submission of women, and you've been laughing the whole time and you've been loving it, you feel complicit and it hits you 10 times as hard. And you think about it 10 times as seriously as when you've been watching the version that was serious. That one is on DVD, but I got to see it live, the Globe one, and I lingered by the gates overhearing conversations as the audience was streaming out. And 700 people walked past me, and they were all talking about feminism. Nobody was talking about where they parked. Nobody was talking about dinner. Nobody was talking about what they were going to do tomorrow. 100% of them were talking about feminism. Families were explaining the history of feminism to their kids. People who were actually slightly inebriated were, delving into feminism in ways that were clearly more candid than they'd opened up with each other before. And it was achieved by making the whole thing rollickingly funny and then plunging into deadly serious at that moment. In such severe contrast with the John Cleese BBC one, which was so uncomfortable and saturated with abuse the whole time, in a way that meant that by the time you got to Kate's speech, you were sort of exhausted of worrying about this and just sort of ready for it to be over. It was so fascinating seeing how the pacing of your own investment in the issues the play brings up changed based on whether it had been funny or whether it had been serious.
I've just realised something, which is that sometimes you can see a production and the way that they do something will affect how you see that bit forever after.
Yes.
Like your Comedy of Errors example could be an example of that. You'll never hear that speech the same way because it did that in that way.
Right, or indeed every Romeo and Juliet I see now, I think more about the Prince of Verona and what they're doing with the Prince of Verona. And I forever will.
We saw a version of Taming of the Shrew in the Fringe in Edinburgh, and it wasn't particularly good. But it had the scene in which Petruchio is telling Kate that he's going to marry her. He's literally raping her during that scene. He's got her against a table and is ramming her into the table. Ever since I saw that, which was incredibly disturbing, whenever I've heard that speech, when it's supposed to be funny or people are doing it in a different way, I can't get that image out of my mind.
Mm-hmm.
Of the thing where he says that he's going to marry her and she has to marry him and he'll take it whatever and he'll be in charge.
That is sometimes one of the goals of a production, and this also applies to writing prose, because sometimes you're writing a scene and you realize, I'm going to have a thing that happens in a lot of stories, but I'm going to subvert it or invert it or comment on it in a way that means forever after, when people see this, they'll think hard about it. And it might be that you're going to have a scene that's about, your main character is going to get picked to go be on the crew of the spaceship and go off, but we're zooming in on the point of view of the person who's left behind. And if you make that potent enough, then every time forever after somebody reads a book about somebody getting to go be an astronaut, you'll linger extra on wondering about the interiority of the people who are left behind, even if that wasn't at all in the intentions of the author of the latter piece of fiction you read, because it was in the intentions of the earlier one. And I saw a leer done by a company of Belarusians in exile.
Whoa.
Who were doing a very gritty political protesty leer that did a lot of very interesting things to it. The scene where Edmund is interacting with and taking care of his father, and his father is giving him orders, and his father is, of course, a positive character in the text. But in this version, they had his father be in a wheelchair. And during that conversation, his father is nasty and violent to him and then starts to urinate. And Edmund has to get a bucket to catch the urine with. And you see his father deliberately moving around where he's aiming in order to spill a lot so that Edgar will have to clean it up. And also toward the end start spraying less far and less far so that Edmund is lured closer and closer to him so that he can then deliberately piss in his mouth at 2 feet away. And then during the second half of the scene, he has to clean it all up with a sponge. And then his father, when he calls him over and takes the sponge and shoves it in his mouth.
Oh, dear.
And, it radically changes how you feel about these characters for the whole rest of the play. But it also distracts me every time I get to that scene, whenever I see a leer forever after. And it's not intended to animate, others, but I do think that the choreographers of that production, part of the art they were trying to create was forever after changing your experience of that scene in every other leer you would ever see. And I feel very complex about moments when people do that kind of thing deliberately that's actually about your future revisiting of art rather than this, because I think it's very useful in moments where you tell a Cinderella story with the empathy reversed, or tell a Wicked Witch story with the empathy reversed, which is designed to make you empathize with every witch you see in a future story in ways that are very much constructive and feminist and questioning. And then there's that one, which I feel like it's making this good character a bad character. It's also making me just sort of distracted and grossed out. I don't believe there is a strict line between when that type of art is positive and when that type of art is destructive. But it's very interesting to think about the fact that it can achieve both of those things. And when you're doing it, when you're subverting or inverting something like that, to think about how much of what you're doing is about now, how much is about future impact, and whether that future impact is sort of attacking or consonant with the original work. And it's a neat question.
That leer sounds territorial. It's literally spraying the wall of the play and saying, marking it, this is how you'll see it, this is how you'll see it, which is very aggressive.
Mm-hmm.
What I was going to ask was, did it make you feel that it was less awful when Gloucester was then blinded?
Somewhat.
Right.
But in that scene, there was a whole lot of other confusing stuff going on with a huge sheet of plastic that was catapulting water around, and they were using peanut butter to simulate feces, and there was a lot happening in this production. So it was an example of a production that was doing so many things that it didn't have time to think about the things that it was doing. And if indeed it had been doing less in the later scene so that I could think about the earlier scene more, the earlier scene might have been more powerful. And I think one of the challenges in a book as well is sometimes you have 100 great ideas of what you want to do in your Lear and what you want to do in your book. And you realize if I have all 100 of these, they're going to compete with each other. I must choose strategically how many of them I can include and how many of them I have to save for another production.
Yeah, I think that is really, really true about writing, that you can really overload what you're doing by throwing everything at the wall and seeing what sticks. It's a technique, but it weakens the force of things.
It's an interesting thing. Sometimes you've set something up so well that then you have to do less in the thing itself because it's already set up so well that it needs you to not interfere with it. And I always think of the example of an interview with the director of the film Silence of the Lambs, which contains the title scene in which Clarice is talking to Hannibal Lecter about her experience with the lambs on the farm when she was young. And that originally that scene was going to come back and forth between the two of them talking to each other and footage of actual lambs and sound effects of the actual sound of lambs screaming when they're scared, and, you know, footage of her as a girl on the farm, and it was going to have flashback content. But that when they filmed the scene, they realized that the conversation was so powerful, the dialogue was so powerful, the characters were so powerful, it was better to just have two people in a room talking to each other. That was more powerful than if the rest of that had been there, because these characters had been so well set up, and the meaning of the scene had been so well set up before, that doing more could interfere with what you'd already done and diminish the power of the sequence.
And that is essentially Shakespearean. He does it with two people talking.
Yeah.
He does it with the language and he does it with the characters. And if you do that right, that is the most powerful.
A very wise director to know that, because that's one of the things that when you get movies of Shakespeare, that's one of the things that I've noticed, that they very often do not trust the characters and the dialogue to carry it, and they'll put in too much cutting away to other things as if they don't trust that, and it diminishes the intensity.
Yes. I always think of Branagh's Henry V, and there's the great sequence in the Siege of Harfleur, where the chorus, which is Derek Jacobi, in one of the most magnificent coats ever achieved by the human species, standing there delivering Shakespeare's beautiful language with explosions of cannons going off in the background. And I keep wanting to have a button that says, please mute the cannons. I want to hear Derek Jacobi delivering this speech. I do not need the special effects. Derek Jacobi is better than special effects. Please turn them off so that I can hear him.
Branagh really never trusts Shakespeare to speak for himself, or rarely trusts Shakespeare to speak for himself, and that I find a fault in Branagh.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he sometimes does. And in fact, in that very same production, I think is the way he does the first chorus, where Derek Jacobi is moving around through the backstage of the Globe Theatre.
That works,
is great. And it has dynamism, and it has motion, and it has interesting things to look at, which film kind of requires. But it also just lets you listen to Derek Jacobi. It doesn't also have the background noise of stagehands chatting with each other, or roars of laughter of an audience on the other side of the wall interfering. It's just letting us listen to Derek Jacobi while interesting visuals are going on. It's neat to contrast those two scenes, which are quite similar to each other, and yet one of them moves me to tears every time, and the other one makes me irked and want to push the imaginary mute cannon button every time, even though they are both magnificent performances in a magnificent film.
The Silence of the Lambs director who decided not to cut to the lambs was somebody who really knew what they were doing, and I feel like I trust that person in a way that I don't trust a lot of directors for that reason.
Mm-hmm.
There was a early 2000s movie of Merchant of Venice, which has Al Pacino as Shylock,
Yes.
where I don't think there's one single speech that you actually see the person deliver it, rather than hear it as a voiceover over a massive sequence of bits of Venice.
Mm.
Yes, and we know Venice is seductive, but...
Yeah. But it's a question of whether you're also making the film for film audiences and the stage play for people who go to plays, which is different. But not necessarily that different. I think that's another thing that the Silence of the Lambs director understands, is that when the characters and dialogue are powerful enough, moviegoers are perfectly happy to watch two people in a room having a conversation and be riveted.
Yep.
But you have to have worked to set it up. So I do think that it'd be really fun to talk a bit before we end about why I think Comedy of Errors is a very difficult play and neat examples of things of Comedy of Errors. So Comedy of Errors, very funny, very, very light, very, very silly play. Lots of very, very silly business in the clowning sense. And one of Shakespeare's easiest storylines to follow. However, an enormous amount of it is about violence towards slaves.
Indeed.
And there are humorous scenes where you have to watch slaves be beaten, and there are humorous scenes where slaves are describing being beaten. And toward the end, there's the speech about how he's been nothing but beaten since the day he was born, and he's woken up in the morning by being beaten, and goes to bed at night by being beaten. When he's hot, his master cools him by beating him. When he's cold, his master warms him by beating him. And also, in the non-beating slaves action segments, what do we have? We have a huge, long, fat joke. And we have several speeches about how wives being jealous about their husbands cheating on them are bad, and it's the women's fault. Mm-hmm. So we have a lot of content that's really quite uncomfortable. So while the story is simple and the characters are shallow, so that the play seems easy, getting your audience to actually have a good time while watching these things occur and listening to this dialogue is very hard. And, in Twelfth Night, if you're worried about your audience being too uncomfortable about the mocking of Malvolio, you can cut the third sequence of mocking of Malvolio because other things still occur in the play. But in Comedy of Errors, other things really don't occur in this play. It's mostly about the comedy of slaves getting beaten up. In 1494, they put it on very suddenly to fill a stage after a disaster, so they could, throw it together pretty quickly. But to make a modern audience comfortable with it, you really need to think hard about how you're going to make that work. Are you going to make it be serious and about this? Are you not? If you're not, how do you make it work?
I like the Globe one that's on DVD because
yes,
at the height of the chaos, when everything is, the entire city is in uproar, there is a gigantic explosive device with the push down handle on the stage,
and it says Acme on it in Greek.
Yes. And the thing is, they're doing they're going, yes, you feel sorry for Roadrunner, but this is they're saying this is a Roadrunner cartoon.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. The beatings are all like poor Coyote getting blown up and having smoke all over his face and starting all over again, pursuing Roadrunner in the next scene. So that's their way of saying this is cartoon violence, not real violence. Mm-hmm. And I think it's a very good production. I love
refer to that production as the one with the shirt.
Yeah.
Yes.
Because it has one of the longest burn setups of any play I've ever seen. Before the play starts, when the audience is still chatting and milling around and there aren't actually things happening yet, Dromio comes out with a basket of laundry.
Yes.
And there's laundry hung up on lines way at the top, and he has to get the laundry down because the laundry is dry. And he gets some of it, but some of it's too high up. And he gets a ladder, and he does very traditional commedia dell'arte lots of, comic bits with this ladder, and the ladder is too short, and he's doing silly things with the ladder and climbing up on the ladder in goofy ways and leaning over on the ladder and getting a different ladder, and it's tippy, and he spends a good 10 minutes trying to get this shirt that's hanging up way at the top of the stage where you just can't reach it. And it's very fun, very traditional clowning that sets this is going to be a commedia dell'arte style production up very well.
Yes.
So that you're used to that. You've watched him with great, he'll get to the top of the ladder and almost reach it. He can almost reach it, then he'll just sigh. And his whole figure droops, and you just know that feeling. You remember it every time you've put your dinner in the microwave and then the microwave suddenly didn't work for some reason. Every time you've gotten your laundry down to the laundry machine and then realized you left the detergent upstairs. You just know that sigh, the sigh of, I have to go do this. You love him and you sympathize with him all throughout this. And then indeed, he still hasn't got the shirt when it's time for the play to start. And as the characters start coming out, he just has to put his ladder away and sort of look longingly at the shirt that's hanging up at the top of the thing. And then the play begins. The play is going for a long time, and many, many, many things happen, and they've done the comedic violence brilliantly. The first major comedic violence with him scene, they've got baskets all over the stage as if this is a market. And so when it's time for his master to beat him, what his master does is pick up fish and hit him on the head with a rubber fish.
Yes.
And then he's dodging and throwing fish in return to try to get away. And there's all this ridiculous business with hurling fish at each other. And he eventually gets away and runs off stage. And his master picks up this huge rubber octopus and swings the rubber octopus around and hurls it after Dromio. And it flies off stage into the darkness. And you hear two women from backstage scream and go, ah! And he says, oh, I'm so sorry. And it's so funny. It's so funny. And nobody is hurt. And it's very clear that nobody is hurt. It's just this wonderful silliness. But it's just enough for Dromio in the next scene to be able to complain in an over-the-top way about the beating. And in that scene where he's describing the beating, and we've just seen the beating and know that it wasn't very severe. He was just sort of hit with a fish once. But in the next scene, he's describing this beating, and he's demoing this beating by having a bread roll and a platter, and he's beating the bread roll up with the platter and saying, quoth, my master said this, and I said that, and he said, I know no wife, no house, no Mr. Bang, 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 bang. And the sister of the wife says, quoth who? And he just gives her this utterly dirty look of like, who do you think is hitting the bread roll over and over with the plate? Like me? No. Which is another one of these. That quoth who line is hilarious in that production. I would not remember that quoth who line is there in any other production. So we've had wonderful business, but, his life, even getting hit with a fish is obnoxious, and more scenes as he's getting more and more tired. And as we get toward the point that things have been so mean to Dromio that even with substituting the violence with a rubber fish, we're still getting uncomfortable. And the business reaches its maximum, and there's the Acme box, and we hit the Acme box, and it blows up, and the whole stage shakes, and the shirt falls, and he gets it. Yes! Yes! And the whole audience cheers. Yay! We got the shirt. We've been rooting for that shirt for an hour and a half. There it is. And it's just at the moment that the audience needed a pick-me-up for the character that we loved and sympathized with. We need Dromio to have a moment of triumph at that moment, because the next scene that he has is going to be his my master wakes me with beating and puts me to bed with beating. We really need a pick-me-up at that moment.
And that's his eucatastrophe.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and so they set it up before the play began, and they left that shirt there for an hour all the way through intermission, and then we have the shirt at the moment of the maximum Coyote Roadrunner silliness with the Acme, and it so worked, and it made the emotional pacing of that work. And exactly, I remember when outlining novels, sitting down and saying, okay, there's a major emotional crisis and grief in this chapter, and there's another one coming up in the next chapter, the audience needs a moment of emotional triumph in the intervening chapter. The audience needs a good thing to happen to someone they love. I need a character that the whole audience loves, and I need something great that the audience has been rooting for to happen to that character. Because just as with Malvolio, in the version with the Velcro balls and the pizza, it was our party that was wrecked. We are rooting for him to get comeuppance, and so the comeuppance feels satisfying. When there's a character that has been suffering in the course of a story, and the whole audience loves that character and is rooting for something good to happen to that character, and then it comes, you feel a little bit like you helped. You feel a little bit like you were rooting for him, just as audiences who are rooting for their sports team feel a little bit like you helped when the sports team wins. And so it feels like, we wanted to help Dromio, and we did, and he's got his shirt. And yeah, Team Dromio, we were on Team Dromio, and Dromio got his excellent moment, and now we're ready to move forward into the next thing where stuff is going to be at risk and scary, and the Duke might execute the nice old man. And we're emotionally ready for that because the character we were rooting for got the thing we were rooting for them to have the whole time. And it's exactly what I do, avoiding specific spoilers, toward the end of The Will to Battle, where in the second to last chapter, there is a triumph for a character that is one of the few characters that 100% of the audience of those books love. Because there are a lot of characters that are set up for some people to like them and some people to not like them, but everybody loves that character, and that character gets that moment of triumph. And you need that emotional pick-me-up to be ready for the intensity of the finale, just as in A Comedy of Errors, we needed that shirt to fall at that moment so that we were ready to face the tensions of the final sequence.
Two things that I want to say. The first is that I had a friend who told me that she hated Comedy of Errors. She'd seen two different productions and read it, and she'd hated it. Nothing could make her like it. And I said, see the Globe production, that'll make you like it. And she did, and it did.
Yay.
So that's an endorsement for the Globe actually getting that to work where it wasn't working for a modern person.
Mm-hmm.
And the other one was that last Saturday we did Antony and Cleopatra on the Discord, and Greer was Cleopatra in the last act. And I think that there is a bit there which does this exactly as well, which is not to give you a moment of triumph, but you cannot have too much unrelieved tragedy.
Mm-hmm.
You've got to actually break the tragedy, and Shakespeare does it there by having the guy who brings the asp on, which you know perfectly well Cleopatra's going to use for suicide.
Mm-hmm.
But the guy who brings it on is a clown, and he's a canonical commedia dell'arte clown,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and he's making jokes. And it's just enough relief of tension that you can wind up again for another death scene, which wouldn't work without that clown going on and on and on about the asp.
There are two things that make it not work, and here we need the Brilliant Henry VI to exemplify the other one. One reason that it doesn't work is that the audience is tired, right? The audience is just grieved for 20 minutes. We kind of need to do something else before we are ready to grieve again. Otherwise, it gets homogenous. But the other reason is that emotions are most powerful when they're increasing, not when they're steadily at max. And, you can be laughing uproariously, and then in the next scene, if it's another uproarious laughter scene, you kind of want to begin from not very funny and ramp up to uproarious laughter again. And if it's tragedy, you need to feel like, oh, it's tragic. Oh, now it's more tragic. Oh, no, not that too. And so you need the tension to go down so that the tension can go up. And one of the things that can be challenging in fiction is if you start off with emotion X at too high intensity, whether emotion X is suspense or grief or hilarity, etc., then it's hard to go up from that. But you can if you go down first, or if you start low. So the BBC Shakespeare Project Henry VI, directed by Jane Howell, which are incredibly hard to get a hold of in the US because they aren't available on Region 1 DVD except through a special educational service. But you can also get them streaming through an off-Broadway streaming service, etc. You can find them if you need them, or you can buy a region-free DVD player and get them for Britain. Jane Howell is about to do 4 plays. She's going to do Henry VI Part 1, Part 2, Part 3, and Richard III. You're going to be in her hands for 13 hours. And in the course of this 13 hours of Shakespeare, you're going to sit through 24 battle scenes. Because that's what's in the script. And she's got to get you through 24 battle scenes. And this is the BBC in 1982. And they have, 3 packs of gum and a rope. They have one set and some dudes, whose costumes are thrown together out of used carpet. And she does not have the fields of France to show you, to get you through these battle scenes. So what is she going to do? And how is she going to make the tension ramp up? She has the first battle scene have pretend bouncy ponies, right? Because the set of these plays is one set, and it looks like a big colorful jungle gym. It's a play castle style jungle gym, and it's wood, and it's, painted bright red and yellow and blue and pink, and it has bouncy rope bridges the way a children's playground does, and towers and turrets you can run up and down, and floppy doors on barn door hinges so they go in and out. And it very much feels like people playing castle, playing war in the way that kids would during recess. And at the first battle scene, she's got Gloucester and Beaufort on bouncy play horses with silly bouncy play horse heads that look like you're riding a pony on a stick, right?
I would call those hobby horses. Would you?
Yes.
Yeah, but not 100% of our audience know exactly what a hobby horse is.
Oh,
but
okay.
Indeed, they're hobby horses. And they have a horse head in the front and then, a horse butt sticking out behind, but they're the height of the actor's waist. And these brilliant actors are delivering their speeches on the pretend horse and slightly moving around as if the pretend horse is restless while they're yelling at each other, and the pretend horse is starting to accelerate and they have to pull the reins of the pretend horse back. And they do a really good job on it, but you can't not smile at the hobby horses. It's very funny. And then they have this silly little battle where everyone is whopping each other, and it just feels like a nothing battle, which means that then when the second battle has a little bit of fake blood, it feels like worse and more serious. And when the next battle has impressive stage combat, it feels like it's ramped up. And when the next battle has, wounded men with bandages leaving afterward, she sets the bar for the battle on the floor with the bouncy hobby horses so that then she can ramp it up for 23 more battles and make each battle be worse and bigger, and make the armor more advanced later so that later on they have plate, but early on they just actually have rugby uniforms spray painted with their coats of arms, so that the reality and immersiveness and seriousness and casualty level ramps up for every battle. And if you compare that to a recent production like Hollow Crown, which has a big budget and has horses and men and plate mail for every battle, it doesn't feel like it ramps up because all the battles are lovely, well-coordinated battles that look like battles. And they all feel the same, and it just feels like warfare is a constant. Whereas in the Jane Howell production, it feels like, at the beginning there's war. Oh no, but the war is getting worse. No, now the factionalism is making it worse. No, don't start the Wars of the Roses. And when Jack Cade's rebellion happens, they set fire to part of the set, and it gets scorched. And it has blood smeared on it, and they don't clean it. And all the later battles have the literal physical damage to this play castle, which now has ash and blackness and blood and broken pieces. And by the time Richard comes to power, England is burnt black, and it's no longer blue and red and yellow and pink and fun. It is a scorched England. And Richard comes to power, and as much as she has made you love Richard from the instant he enters the stage. And this is a magnificently charismatic Richard. You just see him, and you see England already burnt black, and you're like, no, Richard, I love you. Don't start another war. Look around you. Look at how bad it already is. Please don't. And you plead in your heart in a way that no huge budget Real Horses battle scene has ever made me feel, because she set the bar low so that it could ramp up.
And that is the beauty of theater as opposed to film.
It's film of theater, right? It's film on one stage.
It's not opened out.
Yeah, it's not opened out to having on location, it's a set. But she also does the neat thing where, in a play you can't destroy the set because you need it again. You can have a set that self-dismantles intentionally, but you can't actually destroy the set. And
so this is one-time theater.
Exactly. This is single performance theater.
Yeah, that's very good. That's something you can only do if you get to destroy the set.
But it's something you can definitely do in a novel where you have no set. You can destroy it as much as you like. But where specifically you can think about those, where do I set the tone at the beginning so that it can increase? And have I had a battle that's really high intensity or a tragedy that's really high intensity? Do I need a reset? Do I need a clown scene to let the tension go back down again so that it can ramp up again? Do I need a catharsis, happy scene, so I can have the tension reset and the audience feel refreshed by that catharsis so that the tragedy can ramp up again? And so it's amazing how much, for me, my ability to outline a novel well and think about those emotional arcs, which are not plot arcs, they're emotional arcs. How does the audience feel at this moment? Is enriched by watching plays, especially by watching multiple productions of the same play.
Yeah.
And cross-comparing how they handle the emotional arcs of challenges like Comedy of Errors, challenges like Merchant of Venice, and observing moments in productions that work well and that don't, or that change where the weight falls or change when you laughed and when you didn't. So useful for them thinking about the emotional arc of crafting fiction.
And I don't outline, but I also definitely do that. I definitely think about that in those terms, and I feel that is something that I specifically have learned from theatre, and particularly Shakespeare.
Well, and you'll have an emotional arc in your mind, even though you haven't written it down. And
Absolutely.
It hasn't been planned out scene by scene. I'm thinking of Samuel R. Delany saying that he has outlines in his mind of the arc of a novel as a wiggly line. He drew for me at one point the wiggly line for Empire Star. One of my prized possessions is the wiggly line for Empire Star. But that without outlining, you can still very much have a sense of this arc, where the tension is and where climaxes, etc. are, which is not the same thing as the plot.
Yeah.
It's a very different thing from the plot, but it is an important part of the arc and of the planning.
I don't think I have a line. I think I have something like an origami fortune teller, where it flicks back and forth. I mean, I get the comedy inverting into tragedy, I think, a bit from Shakespeare, but I love when I'm being silly and serious at the same time. I like doing that. I have ongoing, essentially the rude mechanicals in Cloud and Ashes are actually playing, they are the goddesses and the gods. That is their role. They are a dedicated troupe, but they're still very funny, I hope. So again, it's not planned with me. It's what feels right at the moment, and how much flicker I get and how much holding on, whether I'm going to prolong a bit of, if it feels right to prolong a bit of tragedy or flicker back and forth with the comic tragic so you don't know which it is and you're bewildered.
Another, choosing intentionally when to have it be a little bit overwhelming and choosing when to make the audience be overwhelmed is another important strategy. So, this has been a great conversation, and now by tradition we end with 3 things. First, all 3 of us will gush about books we've been excited by lately. Then we shall have the all-important discussion of gelato, and finally the administrative mandatory podcast stuff.
But first, Greer,
yes,
where can listeners find more of your amazing stuff?
Most of it is published by Small Beer Press, which is You can find them at smallbeerpress.com, smallbeerpress.com. And my website is greergilman.com. And I have just Sophia Samatar, just bless her heart, she was the one who remembered it was the 30th anniversary of Moonwise and did a wonderful interview. It was a written conversation on the matter of cloud, and that's published by Uncanny Magazine. So you can find it at uncannymagazine.com under the matter of cloud. And I had a lot of fun with that because I had to figure out how I built a universe from tiny little, from single words that caught my attention somewhere. So that was immense fun. And I'm hoping it's fun to read.
So, Joe, what is a book that you have been excited by lately?
Well, when I was in Venice this summer, my friend Thomas was reading Italo Calvino's Invisible Cities, and he kept opening it sort of almost at random and reading me one of the cities, because it's a book that tells the stories of 50 cities or describes 50 cities, and it's very dense. It's almost like poetry. And I think that was the perfect way to experience it. But since then, I have actually been reading it myself and reading all of it. And it's very much something where you want to read one at a time and take it in small doses. But in small doses, it is absolutely beautiful and really, really delightful, though somewhat more sexist than one wishes it were. It is great, and I recommend it. It's fun. So, Greer, what have you been excited about lately?
Oh, just a footnote to that. Harvard once did an installation in which they hung speakers in the trees of Harvard Yard, all speaking different cities from that book.
Neat.
Oh, neat. That is so neat.
That was lovely.
I did a thing on Twitter this summer where I took one photograph, it was a photograph that Ada took from the Rialto of the Grand Canal. And I did 50 different deep dreams of it and posted one every day.
Lovely.
Because the invisible cities are all Venice in an interesting way. Yeah. So, do you have a book you want to tell us about?
Just a couple. I've been obsessed during the pandemic with Cabinets of Curiosities because if I can't get landscapes, I can get inscapes. So this went very well with Susanna Clarke's Piranesi.
Yes.
Because that sea cave world is so ambiguous between inner and outer.
Yes.
And also, I love her style. She's one of the fantasists who has a sort of Sylvia Townsend Warner style, that cool. It's not cold, but it's cool. This is, things are exactly as they are. And I liked that book very, very much. Another book that gave me landscapes that I couldn't have in small was Robert Macfarlane's Landmarks, which is about the language of landscapes, the particular words they use in East Anglia or the Hebrides for certain types of grass or certain kind of wind on water or certain rock formation. And, that is absolutely my jam. And the third one
sounds wonderful.
Yeah, Robert Macfarlane, Landmarks. And the third one, I love Edmund Duvall's Hair with Amber Eyes and The White Road. And he, of course, is a potter. And he's done a book called The Pot Book, which is just pots he admires from antiquity until very, very recent. And they're alphabetically by potter or culture, so that you simply get something from, a Mycenaean pot next to a very modern one that does Ming Dynasty Coca-Cola logos. They are wonderful and mixed and I love material culture. I love what humans do with their hands as well as their minds.
Oh, that sounds absolutely wonderful. That sounds like a book that I would like. Yeah, so Ada, how about you?
I'm going to be hopelessly scholarly because I'm really, really excited by a book that I just got a hold of after hunting for it for years because you can get it out of the library, but I wanted a copy of my own. But it was very, very hard to find because this is a book printed in Geneva in 1988 in French, whose title translates to The Population of European Cities, 800 to 1850, a data bank and short summary of results, edited by Paul Barrioc, Jean Batu, and Pierre Chevre, and it is literally just a list of city, year, population, city, year, population, city, year, population for 200 pages. But it's so great because it has lots of random towns and different areas. It's organized by region. And of course, we don't have complete data for any of this. What it is it'll list a town, Nice, and it'll give you all the years for which we have this data because there was a census, because there was a tax survey, because some precious person did a dissertation and calculated the population based on, the number of gravestones and averaging out of things. And all of that masses of work done at the time by the people who did the effort of a census at pre-modern tech level, the effort of scholars who compiled it since has become this thing where you can watch towns stay the same size and then suddenly grow or shrink. You can watch the plague come and return and return. You can watch industry suddenly hit a port and a port go from being a little trickle to suddenly being a big deal. You can see individual towns only have 2 or 3 entries because we know so little about that town, and so a few records might survive. It might be a town that was bombed badly in World War II, so we lost the archive before anybody had gone in and compiled the information. And it's just such a treasure of not only useful information for thinking about large questions like how do changes in technology, how do changes in fashion and the sudden desire to have more red fabric affect which cities thrive and which don't, but also as a sort of a compendium in which you can, when you know the scholarly world, detect the invisible effort and teamwork of the thousands of people who were necessary to compile the information to make there be a book compiling the population of European cities from 800 to 1850. So even though it's just a long list of city, year, number, it is brilliant, and I've been reading it raptly.
That sounds wonderful.
Yes.
There's so much in the numbers, in between the numbers and around the numbers.
Yeah. And it's a great example of these kinds of scholarly books, which are in a sense so much effort, and the reward to the author of it isn't money. It isn't even usually promotion within scholarship. Yeah. It's just that forever afterward, the scholarship will be better. And that is a book that by existing forever afterward, the scholarship is going to be better in so many ways, in so many fields. And is a proof of what the long hours of the archives really are for, and the way it becomes teamwork across generations. So I love this book, and I love that it exists, and I love that books like it exist, and that books like it will continue to be produced that make the world of scholarship just unilaterally better for every generation afterward.
Oh, that's splendid.
Thank you so much, Greer, for being on and talking to us, and we'd love to have you on again another time because we could have just gone on forever. It was marvelous.
Oh, well, sometime we should talk about, I'm hoping sometime we can talk about Shakespeare's language and strategies of language.
Exactly what I was
thinking. For part 2.
Language and rhythm. We can talk about rhythm.
Another time.
That
would be wonderful. Okay, so now the boring bit. This podcast is released under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives International 4.0 license.
Now I want to rewrite that to be an iambic pentameter. You can support us and get episodes in advance at patreon.com/Ada Palmer, and you can support Jo and get her wonderful poetry at patreon.com/BlueJo.
And you can find us on Twitter and our books and things at joaltonbooks.com and adapalmer.com. So until next time, ex urbe ad astra.
Ad astra.
Ad astra.